Good morning. My name is Joanne, and I will be your conference operator today. At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the Pipeline SMS Tools webinar conference call. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. After the speaker's remarks, there will be a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during this time, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. If you would like to withdraw your question, please press the pound key. Thank you. I would now like to hand the call over to your presenter today, Mr. Stuart Salters. Thank you. Mr. Salters, you may begin your conference.
All right. Thanks, Joanne. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here this morning on the Pipeline SMS Tools webinar. My name is Stuart Salters, and I'm a policy advisor here at API. Before we get started, just with representatives from several different operating companies, want to remind you of the API antitrust guidelines as we go throughout this call. So if you can listen as I read through these. It's API's policy to comply with the antitrust laws. API staff and member company representatives should observe the following guidance. No discussion or forecasting of prices for goods or services provided by or received by a company. No sharing or discussing any company's confidential or proprietary information. No discussion of any company's specific purchasing plans, merger, divestment plans, production information, inventories, or costs. No sharing or discussion of specific company compliance costs unless publicly available. No agreement or discussion regarding the purchase of sale or goods or services. Such decisions are independent company decisions. No discussion of how individual companies intend to respond to potential market economic scenarios or government action. Discussion should be limited to generalities. No disparaging remarks regarding specific vendors, products, or services. If the discussion presents an antitrust issue, raise your concern immediately. If the discussion continues, please leave the meeting. Because you have the concern, immediately report your concern to API's Office of the General Counsel and to your company's own counsel. At this point, I will turn it over to the presenter for today's webinar, Anne-Marie Kaiser. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anne-Marie Kaiser. I'm with Marathon Pipeline. I'm the Process Safety Supervisor, and I'm going to lead the Pipeline SMS Tools webinar today. As we get started, we'll walk through sections of it. When we get to good breaking points, I will ask that the operator open the line for questions, and then we'll keep going, and I'll ask for questions again, and we'll finish up with questions at the end. So if you've got them while we're going through, please write them down, and we'll get to them at certain parts during the webinar. So we'll go ahead and get started. Our format will be an hour presentation, approximately, with 30 minutes for questions at the end or questions throughout. We'll use the tools and the booklets that are available at www.pipelinesms.org. So if you'd like to look at them there or follow along there, that link is also available to you. Our agenda will go over the booklets first, so if you're aware of the 3 booklets that were put together, with an emphasis on booklet 3. We'll also go over some of the implementation tools, and we'll do questions and answers on the tools, and then we'll finish up with any questions on RP 1173 in general. So booklet number 1 is the why. So we developed that as our first booklet to give folks an overview on why a pipeline SMS will improve pipeline safety. So if you're wondering in your own companies why would we do this, or why pipeline SMS or 1173 is important, this booklet will help with some of that. It provides background on the development of API RP 1173. It also talks about how other industries have utilized safety management systems. It also talks about the importance of safety culture, and the intention of pipeline SMS is to be used by all operators of all sizes and experience. So it's also flexible and scalable, so it doesn't have to be followed exactly, but it needs to be followed to what makes the most sense for your company. And then it also goes over the leader's role in pipeline SMS and how important that is to make sure it's successful and sustainable. Booklet number 2 is in the series is the what. So what is it? What is pipeline SMS? What is API RP 1173 all about? In this booklet, will go over the description of the 10 pipeline SMS elements and their importance. It'll also overview the plan, do, check, act cycle and how critical it is to implement those elements. So it's one thing to implement all of the elements. It's another thing to use them in a plan, do, check, adjust cycle over and over again. It also goes through details on the flexibility and scalability. So as I mentioned earlier, it should be fit for purpose in your company, whether you're a large operator or a small operator or a mid-size operator. And then in addition, and this is an important piece too, is it's the ways each element strengthens an organizational safety culture. So safety culture is a big push of this. It's one thing to have a safety management system, a nice booklet that sits on the shelf. It's another thing to live and breathe it, we'll say, from everyone, from your frontline workers all the way up through your organizations. So book 3, what I wanted to spend some time on today is actually how you implement a pipeline SMS. So if you look at the booklets, you look at RP 1173 and think to yourself, how do I do this? How, my company has a lot of other requirements that we have to deal with. We have a lot of things in place already. How do we fit this in? Or, oh my goodness, this is huge and I don't know where to start. This booklet was developed to help you pick a starting point. Again, it's just suggestions to help you get started, and you need to do what's best for your company. But it's a good way to figure out how am I going to do this to get the most value out of pipeline SMS. So we'll go through each of the major sections of the booklet. If you are on pipeline-sms.org, you can open up the booklet and look through it, or if you have a hard copy, you can look through it as well. But I will hit the high points of the different sections as we walk through. So introduction and background. Again, it's designed to be scalable to an organization of any size, scope, or sophistication, and is flexible to account for existing management systems within an organization. So by no means is it throw out everything you have and put this in its place. It's how do you take what you have and mold it into a safety management system. The booklet also includes guidance on how to build and execute an implementation plan for API RP 1173. And again, it's just suggestions. If it's too much for your company, you can always tailor it to what makes sense. Or if it's not enough, you can always come and gather information. But there is a lot of information in there. Industry-wide implementation and support. Some of you on the phone, it looks like you have been to some of the workshops that we've had. So there's workshops out there for industry-wide implementation support. There are the booklets that we're going through, and there's tools, and there'll be more to come, but most of that support can be found at pipeline-sms.org. And it also provides contact information to API should you need more than what's out there. Scalability, flexibility, and maturity is another piece of booklet 3. It applies to you regardless of your current SMS experience. So whether you've been using one forever or you've never used one before, API RP 1173 can be used to fit your needs. So if you've got a comprehensive safety management system already, you can compare yourself to what 1173 has and maybe pull in those few bits and pieces that the RP speaks to that you may not have yet. And if you have no formal safety management system, you can use RP 1173 to establish your own pipeline safety management system. And the intent is it's not to check all the boxes and say, yep, I meet every shall in API 1173. It's to, yes, first do that, but then where do you go from there? So how do you use plan, do, check, adjust to mature and get better? So we call it a journey. You're never done. You just continue to get better. And then there are a few implementation approaches that you can take. Again, no one size fits all, but there are some suggestions that we wanted to make sure we got out to folks. And that is that top management are actively engaged and supportive. It's very important to have that top management buy-in and pushing and, just to be there and support it so it stays going. Managers and supervisors, again, they need to be identified and involved and support the pipeline safety management system. And then as you go throughout your organization, you want to make sure that those requirements of your safety management system as they apply to your operators are clearly understood. So you and your company may need to reread the RP several times. You may need to put together information to pass along to different levels in your organizations to understand the RP and how it applies to them. But really, the whole document is well worth the read, and each piece fits in with another. So even if you read it once, it's always good to get in there and read it again. And then also there's the internal appraisal and self-reflection on areas for improvement that are performed. So as you get into your implementation, it's okay to take a step back and look and see how you're doing, and is this working right, and are we moving forward at the speed we need to, at the depth we need to? Is it too complicated? Do we need to go back and simplify it? So self-reflection as you move forward, and it doesn't have to be perfect out of the gate. The next piece, and another big piece of it, is safety culture, to make sure your implementation is a success. I think we talk a lot about personal safety culture. This is taking that type of concept and moving it to a company-wide. So your pipeline safety management system would be how you do business. So whether you're executing a procedure, whether you're making a budget change, whether you're getting ready to run a tool, all of those things that culture needs to be factored in there. So it's a shared vision of respect for risk and safety, a consistent integrated approach to collaboration across all business functions, so not just operating in your own silos, cutting across your organizations, a positive attitude to going beyond compliance rather than just meeting the minimum. And if you're an operator in the field and you're doing your procedure and you're doing it in a certain way, you know why you're doing it, and understanding some of the risk if maybe you skip a step or do a step out of order. So again, just how can you get better other than just meeting the minimum? A feeling of collective responsibility for public safety, employee, contractor safety, and protection in the environment and all that you do. So anyone who puts together drawings or executes procedures or works in the operations centers, all of those people have that responsibility for public safety and people safety and protection of the environment. So working to understand that they know that, and that every move that they make is important and it's there for a reason. So moving on to the second section of the book is an implementation basics. So how do you tackle this, especially if you don't have a safety management system in your company? How do you go about doing this? So one of the options that we provide in the book, or suggestions we provide in the book, is an implementation overview, and it's set up like a project. And it's shown there on the screen, but it's also a lot more visible in the book. But, tasks to start the project or initiate the project would be naming the project sponsor, confirming the scope, if there's any budgeting that you need to get, so on and so forth. And then the next step is the gap analysis, which some of you may have already done. There's tools out there, and that's basically comparing 1173 to what you have in your company. So understanding your existing state, understanding the maturity of your existing safety management system if you've got one, and then understanding what it's going to look like in the future, where you want it to be in the future. You want to look at any overlaps or misalignments that you might have between RP 1173 and what you currently have. Again, we don't want it to add things on or add layers on top. We want it to work within the programs that you have and improve the programs you have. Identifying any aspects of RP 1173 that might not be in your existing safety management system or within your company, and then confirming your gaps and documenting your gaps. And later on in the webinar, we'll get into a suggestion or a sample gap analysis. Moving along into project implementation, we want to prioritize and select the gaps to close, develop plans, confirm your costs and schedules and resources, resolve any organizational conflicts or impacts, make sure you apprise management of your plan, make sure it's progressing, and just make sure there's constant communications to your sponsors, to your upper management, so they're aware of, hey, this is what we're doing to conform with RP 1173 within our organization. And then the final step would be establishing that support team, so to keep things moving and going for the long term, tracking and publishing progress to appropriate folks within your organization, reviewing your results against what your plan is, and evaluating if your goals were met, and rolling in if there's anything new. So it's kind of the check and adjust of your project implementation. All right, so moving on into implementation fundamentals, element components, element breakdowns, and considerations for implementing each. If you're following along in your books, it's page 27 is where I'm starting, but implementation fundamentals, some options to do that. What we did in the book was provide a page or a couple pages on each of the elements and outline the components of each element and outline some barriers and opportunities to outline what are some barriers that you might run into or that you are running into, and then maybe some opportunities on how to implement each element in the best way possible. Again, some of the suggestions may not be applicable to all operators, but there are options that are out there, and again, you need to make it work for the size of your company and the risks that your companies are or that they have. So element components, each of them, when you go through the elements, have within the RP, they talk about having an owner, a policy, a process, procedure, key performance indicators, so metrics developed, and then authorities. So an owner would be an identified person within the organization who is accountable for the element content, and API 1173 says you need to have one for each one of the elements. A policy, every element should be aligned to a policy that describes the requirements that define expectations and the behaviors required for success. Process, the process part of the element is describing the activity to be performed, so it's a lot of the doing to meet required policy, and organizational roles responsible for carrying out the activities. And large elements like operational controls, they may have multiple processes because you've got operating procedures, asset integrity, management of change. So those are some of the larger elements, and there may be multiple processes inside those elements, and that's okay. Procedure then, each process requires a set of written procedures, so how are you going to execute the management of change process, operating procedure process, all the different pieces and parts of the elements. Key performance indicators are needed for each element, and so how are you measuring performance? How do you know if your element is fit for purpose or if it's driving improvement? So that's another piece of each element to consider. And then authority within each element. Certain key decisions will be made, such as which is the best risk mitigation strategy, and employees need to understand their decision-making authority. And also know if they need, something changed or what's the best risk mitigation strategy, who to elevate that information to. So I wanted to pull out an example of one of the elements of API 1173 and walk through what the book looks at. So from purpose, and involves stakeholders, barriers to success, and some factors for success as well. So each of the elements are divided this way, and it'll have a purpose. So the purpose for implementing stakeholder engagement, it outlines that the stakeholders for Pipeline SMS are both internal and external. We've given some examples of what those external stakeholders and internal stakeholders could include. Now, there could be more to add to that list or less if you don't have those type of people in your organization. All stakeholders have different expectations, and you want to make sure that you consider all of those viewpoints and understand all of those viewpoints. So as you're engaging with those stakeholders, you're providing them the information that you need, and you're also asking them with the information that you would like for them. An important thing here in stakeholder engagement is to ensure a culture of internal and external stakeholder engagement supports proactively passing concerns to a pipeline operator where they can be addressed. So having that ability to pass concerns from those internal and external stakeholders And then from the pipeline operator side, taking that information and promoting an environment of mutual trust. So involve stakeholders, employees, and contractors. There's also the ones that we consider on the external side as public emergency responders, government regulators, boards, customers, competitors, and so on and so forth. So when you're in the stakeholder engagement element, some of the barriers that you might run into that would make it hard to make this element successful would be that you'd have no defined stakeholder list. Maybe you have lack of trust. Maybe your stakeholders don't trust sending information up to you. Lack of communication and feedback. So that communication and feedback goes in both directions. So we are the pipeline operators taking feedback from folks, but then also communicating back to them what they're doing with that information. Even if it's, thanks for the suggestion, we're not going to do anything at this time because we do A, B, and C. So making sure that communication and feedback loop are open and going in both directions. So some opportunities to leverage for the stakeholder engagement element would be to identify and use preferred center of communications for every stakeholder. So do you have a communications plan that shows how you're going to communicate with all of the stakeholders that you have defined? And then taking advantage of non-traditional communication channels. So internet chat, social media. There's a multitude of ways to get messages out to folks. So those would be some things to keep in mind. So then questions to ask yourself, and again, this is in all the elements outlined in the booklet. And so how will you fulfill the expectation of each stakeholder group? So once you have your stakeholder groups outlined, what are their expectations and how will you meet them? And when you report to stakeholders, what kind of data will you make available? I mean, you wouldn't want to throw everything at them, and I guess you'd also want to make sure that whatever you're providing is understandable to them as well. Or what type of information, too, would your company be okay with making available? That's another thing to consider. And then another one, again, back to the feedback loop, is how do you monitor stakeholder expectations in order to detect changes? So, your local emergency planning commissions or the folks that live along your right-of-way, are things changing? Did they run into a bad experience with someone? How do you make sure that any of those expectations have changed? If they have changed, how will you go to address them? So lots of interactive feedback with your internal and external stakeholders. Factors for success is to respect each stakeholder's viewpoint, listening techniques, why they say what they say and what they actually say versus maybe what you think they say. And then understand your stakeholder landscape. Who is most impacted? Who has most influence? Who is supportive? So who are some of those people early on that are really supportive of what you're trying to do and get them on board, and maybe learn from them and how you can reach out to folks that maybe aren't willing to jump on board right away. So like I said, each of the 10 API RP 1173 elements are outlined in Booklet 3 in that manner. So as you go through and are looking to implement each element or make the element that you may already have better, this is a guide to help you do that. So in addition, towards the end of the book, there are a couple of examples of how the plan, do, check, adjust cycle works. So there's one on integrity management. There's just the general overall plan, do, check, act cycle if you haven't used that before. But the one that I wanted to talk with today is PDCA, or plan, do, check, act, how that's reflected in management review. So you've got each phase of the plan, do, check, adjust cycle is reflected in robust implementation of the management review and continuous improvement. Your plan and do, we do lots of that, I would say. Plan a lot, we do a lot, but then how do you come back and check what you've done and make any adjustments? And that, those adjustments could come by your management review. So when you review your pipeline SMS or you review your processes with your upper management and go through the plan, do, and check some of that checking and some of that acting or adjusting, could happen after that management review as well, when you have a different set of eyes reviewing it. But for planning, the plan portion of PDCA, if you go back to the Plan, Do, Check, Act wheel that's on the left-hand side of the book on your screen, plan would be identify internal and external stakeholders involved in preparing for your review. So who are you going to pull together to review this information? Your schedule development and output requirements, so your KPIs, risk reviews, evaluation. Your do is actually conducting the management review. The check of the process is for reviewing inputs for completeness and timeliness and determine the extent to which management review outputs were implemented. So if outputs came out of your management review, have you documented them? Have you followed through with them? Do you have an update on them? Or have you gotten any from the management review? And then act. You'd make adjustments as necessary to improve production and gathering of management review input requirements, and then make any changes to your processes if needed. There's also tools and support to operators that are out there too that are involved or included at the end of the book. With that being said, I know it's a really quick overview of booklet number 3, but I'd like to open it up and see if anyone has any questions regarding book 3 before we move into the implementation tools. So Joanne, if you could open up the floor for questions.
Certainly, Ms. Kaiser. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. Once again, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad for you to ask a question. There are no further questions from the phone lines at this time. I would like to hand the conference back to today's presenter. Please continue.
Okay. Thank you, Joanne. So next on the list is implementation tools. And again, on pipeline-sms.org, there are instructions and an implementation spreadsheet. And the implementation spreadsheet is what we'll go over in a little bit. And that's the actual gap analysis. And then there's also a document out there for peer-to-peer sharing. So if you'd like to meet with other pipeline operators to talk through RP 1173, how implementation's going, any questions, concerns, that setup is available as well too for folks to use. So as I mentioned, we're going to go through the gap analysis, and this is a tool that was put out there for folks to use to compare their current state against their desired state. So what does my company have now versus what does API RP 1173 say? And if there's gaps in there or differences, then you would build your implementation plans and assign folks to do them, assign priority to them. So this implementation spreadsheet that's out on the website for folks to use is an attempt to do that, so to provide a tool to folks to say, hey, I'd like to compare what I have today against RP 1173. So the spreadsheet has 2 tabs, so when you get into it, I know sometimes I forget to look along the bottom, but there are 2 tabs, and they're both useful. There's the pipeline operator and the gap analysis, and depending what version of Windows you have, they may look a little different, but they're both down there. And another item to note is that the gap analysis doesn't outline RP 1173 verbatim. It's just picking from the high points, so it's a shorter list of questions. So you'd want to read API RP 1173 prior to completing that gap assessment to make sure you have a good understanding of where those questions are coming from. So the first tab, if you go to the pipeline operator tab, this is an important tab to have because it meets a few requirements of the RP, and this allows you to outline your top management as required in the RP. So the top management shall lead and demonstrate its commitment to the development. There needs to be clear accountability for implementation and identifying executives accountable for implementation. So this is a good place to document who those people are, which ones are accountable. So you've got your element numbers up here that correspond with the elements in API RP 1173. And so you list out your top management, and then an A if they're accountable, or an I for those that are involved. The same would go for management. So you'd have responsible folks and involved folks at your management level. And then again, the support and dedication of management is required to ensure that proper resources are allocated and stewarded to achieve the timely development and implementation of an effective pipeline SMS. And again, there's a requirement in the RP to identify your managers responsible for each element of pipeline SMS. So this is a good place to do that. And again, your element numbers are listed across the top. And then you've got your implementation team. So those are the folks doing the work. So you'd want to outline your subject matter experts, your leader, those are involved. So it's a good place when you start your gap analysis to list out who's doing what, who's got responsibility for what. And again, that'll help you with your gap assessment, and it'll also help you meet the requirements that are outlined in Section 5 of RP 1173. So that's the pipeline operator tab. The gap analysis tab is extensive, and that outlines high-level questions derived from the requirements of API RP 1173. And it's your guide to help compare your current programs against the basic requirements in the RP and develop and implement an action plan. So each in column A, you'll see that the sub-element of RP 1173 is listed, and then the requirement. So in this example, is there a procedure for performing risk management? So as you move along, you'll see there's the question again, and then there's example evidence that your company would have. So you'd put in whatever, well, this gives an example of what that evidence would look like. So you have a risk management procedure, or you do process hazard analysis, things like that. You can add more example evidence if you have some, but actual evidence is where you list what you actually have. So in the example, it's listed what they have. So your documents, your procedures, how do you perform risk management within your company? So it allows you to write it out and see, hey, what do I have? And make sure you can articulate what you have. And it's not just a thought, it's an actual document or a procedure. So moving along on that same example, do you have a gap? And in this example, the answer was yes. And why? Why did they had a lot of programs, why do they have gaps? And it looks like the procedures that they have do not cover all pipeline assets. And then procedures do not identify the threats to the pipeline as well, except the topic threat. So they could stand to get a little bit better in this example at the procedures that they have. So then, upon finding that they have a gap and describing it, and it can be as descriptive as you need it to be, you need to develop potential actions of how to close the gap. So row by row, in this example, they came up with a list of items to go and do. So here's some things to go and do to meet that Section 7.1 of RP 1173 for our company. And again, just examples. So then once you have the gaps listed, you want to outline, is it required? And so those are listed out too. So NC means not chosen, R means required, and O means optional. And it says, for this column, many potential actions may be listed, but not all actions are needed to initiate the continuous improvement cycle or establish a management system. Actions that are simply incremental improvements may be identified as optional. If the action is needed to initiate the continuous improvement cycle or establish a management system, the action should be identified as required. So all of those potential actions or gap closure plans is another good word for that section. You need to review them all and decide which ones are simply incremental improvements or which ones are going to fill those holes. Now, while they're both important, if you're going towards compliance, then you'd want to go after those required ones first. NC is designated in this tool as if and when the decision is made for which actions will be completed, any excluded actions will be identified as not chosen, or NC. So if you're looking at the example, the first one was not chosen. The second one, develop a risk management procedure for pipeline assets, was required. And then for incremental improvement, there's an optional idea. And so that's a list that can be developed. You can either use the spreadsheet or you can use some kind of recommendation tracking system to house that information and get it out as you need it. But the important part of it is that it's documented. You've listed which ones are required, or that your company is not choosing to do, or ones that are optional to do, and make sure you have those in the queue and follow them through to completion. So your next step, once you've got your items chosen, is you assign priority to them, so you can prioritize which ones you want to go after first. And high, medium, and low are defined as follows. The high is the action is required, and other actions are dependent on this action being completed. The section addresses key risk management concerns. The action addresses a known safety issue. Medium, the action may or may not be required. The action completion is not needed for other high priority actions to be completed. The action improves the effectiveness of existing activities or actions. And then you've got the low option too. The action is not required. It does not address key safety or integrity management issues. The action is independent of other action items being completed. So that's how this tool is set up. If you have another tool or would like to change that, by all means you can do that, but that's how this tool is set up. And then an important thing to add to are your owners. So you can go back to that first tab you were on and figure out, well, here's my element owner, or here's my the right management person, or the subject matter expert for risk management. So they may be the owner in that case, and then assign an appropriate due date, and then periodically check back in and see what the status is. So what have we done, and how can we, and what are there any barriers out there? Do we need to get into additional information to help move this forward? So with that being said, that was a quick overview again of the gap analysis tool that's out there. And the instructions for it are also out on the Pipeline SMS website. So with that was all the information that I had put together to present today. Is there anyone that has questions on the tools at all, or API 1173 that I could field? And Joanne, if you could open up the line for questions.
Certainly, Ms. Kaiser. Once again, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Once again, it's star, then the number 1 for you to ask a question. Your first question comes from the line of Leroy Haskins. Go ahead with your question. Your line is open.
Yeah, just refresh my memory. When does PHMSA looking to have RP 1173 actioned and audible?
Stuart, do you want to go ahead and answer that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I can offer a couple of thoughts, and then Anne-Marie, feel free from an operator perspective to chime in. So again, this is Stuart Salters from API, and we have been working with PHMSA very closely with this. Obviously, during the development, they were very instrumental in the writing and authoring of the RP, and so they have a keen interest in it. To this point, we haven't heard any finite dates about operators must do something by some date, or they must have action plans in place by some date. So at this point, as far as we know, from what we've heard, it's really on the operators to execute and implement on their own as they see fit. And so a couple other kind of flavor comments to add is the administrator seems to have a good relationship with the NTSB, and Chairman Hart has a lot of experience with the aviation industry. And so when the aviation industry kind of went on this road with management systems and sharing and learning and all kinds of good stuff, they kind of let the industry do it on their own. And there was a lot of success because the industry, like I feel like a lot of the pipeline operators realize, hey, something needs to happen and we need to do this. This is good stuff. So there again, I'm not saying something may change tomorrow, but at least from where we are right now, conversations with the administrator, conversations with the regulators, nothing is set in stone. It's really on the operators to implement and execute these programs and and get things in place. So.
Okay, thanks.
Your next question comes from the line of David Johnson. Go ahead with your question. Your line is open.
Thanks. First, a comment to follow up on what Stuart just said. I think everybody knows that rulemaking takes a long, long time, but PHMSA has actually started implementing at least parts of this in enforcement actions, in corrective action orders, safety orders, and consent orders. So they have other ways of implementing this. That's on an individual basis, but as opposed to nationwide, but it is available to them. My question is in the implementation and gap analysis spreadsheet that we were just talking about. Excuse me. Is the 1173 itself, the document, has 150 or so imperatives in it, shall statements that are multi-part, and I was wondering if the implementation spreadsheet accounts for those, because you were talking about a lot of things. The company has to decide whether they're going to do a certain thing or not, or whether it's a high priority or not. And does that take into account the 150 or so mandatory statements in the standard?
Right. It's a good question, and it doesn't capture all of them. However, kind of a preview for what's coming in the future, what the implementation team has been working on is a conformance audit to 1173. And I think when we went through it, we found like 234 shall statements. So we're coming up with the list of what those are, and then you'll be able to you'll at least have that list in front of you and be able to compare what you're doing to what the shall statements are in the RP. This is just an kind of an overview of those. I think a lot of them are captured, but not into the detail where it's picking at every section like that longer conformance audit type tool that'll be coming in the future will have. And I think that's in the guidance for doing the gap analysis is to make sure you've read RP 1173, so you're understanding what the shalls are as you're going through that shorter gap analysis. Does that help?
Well, it answers the question.
Okay.
I'm not sure how how to as one implements this that and it's we probably counted a little bit differently, but that very, very large number of imperatives in the RP it is going to present some challenges and seems to in the notion of scalability and implementation over a period of time certainly presents some philosophical challenges.
Mhm. Yep. Are there other questions out there?
Once again, I would like to remind everyone, if you wish to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We have a question coming from the line of Paul Hagenbrack. Go ahead with your question. Your line is now open.
Yeah, along those same lines of, a certain number of imperative things that we need to do, or 150 or 200 shalls or something like that. My first exposure to safety management system was with OSHA, and what I really liked about it, for a small company like ours, you got to choose which ones you thought were the highest priorities. Now, it might take you a long time to get through all the shalls, so I guess I'm a little concerned that we're going to have this document that we're going to fill out, and it's going to tell us we have this 150 high priority things that we need to do, and we're working on the top 6. And the top 6 might take us a long time to do a good job. So I don't know if there's really a question in there. There's more of a concern that we're going to take this seriously. We're going to try to hit the highest priority things and get them done first. But somehow there's got to be a recognition that, based on the size of your company in particular, you might not have the resources to do all these gaps and all these shalls all at one time.
Right, and I think that was another reason of having the gap analysis put together, is so you could document it and say, yep, we know we have 10 open items that we have to go address, but hey, these here are top 5 high priority based on the risk of our company. We're going to go after that first, and it's going to take us a while to get there. And I'm hoping that having that plan outlined in the gap analysis says, yep, we know they're there, but we're going to go tackle these other ones first.
Yeah. And is there an expectation from PHMSA or anybody to have a, like maybe 2017 we're going to attack these 6 things, 2018 is going to be the next 4 or 5 or 10, 19, 20, 21. Is there an expectation that we have like a 5-year plan on how we're attacking all these gaps?
Stuart, I haven't heard anything like that. I'm assuming it would be different for each company, but I didn't know if you had any additional insight on that.
Yeah, Paul, this is Stuart. I think, Dave mentioned it earlier. From an operator perspective, they do have that the leverage through enforcement actions, enforcement cases that they can ask for that type of stuff from individual operators. But on a industry-wide basis, we haven't heard anything. I think one thing to note though is definitely the resource constraints and the time and financial resources that it may take to execute some of the closing of these gaps. And it's interesting, the implementation team. I meet with the implementation team very often, and that's a question that comes up all the time. Is there's so much work that needs to be done, and honestly, I think where we've landed is, like Emery said, if you can document and you have a plan, and even if there may be a gap or there may be a situation where you've decided that it's not critical or it's not, not the important part for your company to do at this point, and as long as you have the documentation and the proof of why you're taking that action, then that's then that's a good path forward. So it's kind of I think at some level you could say that all the gaps will never be closed, because if you do the continuous improvement loop, then you're going to find new stuff. And then you could also say all the gaps can never be closed because you got to prioritize and you got to spend your resources and put your resources where they need to be. So we definitely hear you and hear the concern, and it's something we're trying to figure out tools and methodologies to share with the industry that helps kind of address that.
Okay, thank you. By the way, I prefer areas of improvement instead of gaps, but sounds nicer.
Yes.
Okay.
Your next question comes from the line of Anna Bolivar. Go ahead with your question. Your line is now open.
Hi, good morning. I guess my question is more on feedback, if you have gotten any from the industry. The company I work for is fairly large, and I don't know that we necessarily have a lot of gaps. I know we can do things better, right? There's areas of improvement. I like that word. But I think for the most part, we address all of the elements of 1173. I think our biggest issue is going to be change in culture for getting buy-in from our employees to bring issues if they have any or if they see any so that we can address them and close those gaps. Have you gotten any feedback as to how other companies or people who are actually implementing this or have already implemented it, how they are addressing that issue of culture change and communication and closing that bridge between the people who are actually doing the work and the people who need to address the issues?
I know that's something that in our company we're working through as well. Like how do we make that culture shift? How do we share across, the different pieces of our company, and then how does that filter down to folks? So I know that's something that we still need to work on or improve. So I don't know, Stuart, have you heard anything back from the discussions you've had with folks?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would think that's probably the top challenge is the safety culture, is how do you affect change within a culture. Obviously, leadership has an impact on that in terms of how your leaders are leading. Are they showing culture? Is the way they show it trickling down to all levels of the organization? So, and then even if you want to dive into it and you really kind of look at this continuous improvement, is how do you measure culture? How do you see whether it's improving or declining? If you take the PDCA philosophy to that part of the pipeline SMS, which I think you would need to. And so I know we had the two workshops, the face-to-face workshops in Houston earlier this year, and I know that was a well-attended session. They had a lot of good feedback for folks that were involved in that, and so it may be something we look to in the future as to maybe a workshop or some type of webinar or session where it's specific to that safety culture concern, just because it does seem to be a important one and a challenging one.
Yeah, I think that and communication. I think that we have folks. I don't know what are the other companies out there, but where I am, there's folks all over the place. Right? We have different areas, and to get everybody to reach everybody, right, so that we can talk to everybody and everybody knows what we're doing and what we're going to do with this recommended practice, and so that we engage them so that they're aware that's happening. I mean, communication seems to be a big challenge, and I think that that's what we're struggling with the most is communication, so that we can engage our employees and then create that culture change, which will be painful and slow, and we are aware of that. But I think that I really would like to know if anybody has had success stories so we can try to implement something similar.
I think one of the things that has worked for us, and it is time consuming, and we do have people spread out, is our management goes to each area every year to talk with employees about strategic planning and what our culture is and things like that. So that was a start, and yes, it's a lot of traveling and a lot of getting to places, and but that's one way we've tried to address it, because it is hard when you've got people all over the place and not in one area. So that's one way I guess we've tried to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Once again, if you wish to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. There are no further questions from the phone lines at this time. I would now like to hand the conference back to today's presenter. Please continue.
Okay, great. I'd just like to wrap it up. I appreciate the attendance today, and just what I've got on the screen now is the pipelinesms.org website, and it has booklets 1, 2, and 3 on there, as well as some of the SMS workshop materials that we had earlier this year. It also has the webinar materials on it that we went over today, and then the additional tools are on the bottom. There's a lot of other good information that's out here too, so if you haven't been out, you can go check it out. And there's also contact information if you'd like more information on 1173 or assistance with implementation. So with that, again, I appreciate it. Thanks for joining, and have a good day.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude our conference for today. Thank you for your attendance. You may all disconnect.